In early 1937, China's war with Japan no longer looked like a distant border fight. It spread, month by month, into a struggle for the country's main roads, rivers, and cities. At the center sat Nanjing, the capital of the Chinese government. That fact changed everything. Capitals were not just places on a map. They held ministries, commanders, files, money, and the idea of national control. For Japan's leaders and military planners, taking Nanjing promised a clear strategic prize. It threatened China's ability to coordinate resistance and move Japanese forces deeper along key transport lines. Just as important, it promised a psychological victory. If the capital fell, many expected China's government to break, or at least to lose authority at home and abroad. The war, they believed, could be forced towards surrender. Inside China, that same logic created a trap. Holding the capital became a symbol of legitimacy, so retreat looked like weakness even when the odds worsened. Nanjing also sat close enough to major front lines that the danger grew fast once Japanese armies pushed inland. By late 1937, the city's fate carried more than military meaning. It became a test of national survival and a target with consequences far beyond its walls. By late 1937, Japanese troops pushed deeper into China and the front moved fast. Defeats along the way opened the road toward Nanjing. In the capital, the threat stopped sounding distant and started shaping every decision. The Chinese government weighed what it could save and what it could not. Offices packed files. Leaders prepared to leave. The message to the city was clear. The center was about to shift elsewhere. The evacuation did not feel orderly from the street. Rumors outran announcements, and panic spread ahead of the army. Some officials left early. Others hesitated, and the gap between plans and reality widened by the hour. Soldiers arrived from shattered units, mixed with new recruits, many without clear orders. Defense lines changed, then changed again. The capital still held the title, but it started losing the basic functions a city needed to stay coherent. As the Japanese advance tightened, people tried to choose a single safe direction and found none. Families rushed to the gates hoping to escape, while others stayed because they had nowhere to go or feared the roads even more. In the confusion, uniforms became a danger as much as protection, and men tried to hide their military ties. Food and transport disappeared into the crush. Nanjing broke into individuals making desperate calculations minute by minute. On December 13, 1937, Japanese troops entered Nanjing. The Chinese defense had already collapsed, and the lines between soldier and civilian blurred in the rush to escape. Units broke apart, weapons were abandoned. Some men tried to hide in plain clothes, hoping to be treated as non-combatants. But the city no longer had functioning authority. Orders stopped traveling, policing disappeared. In that vacuum, fear spread faster than facts. The fall of the capital became an open-ended emergency. Inside Nanjing, a small group of foreign residents did something unusual. They drew boundaries on a map and declared an international safety zone, a limited area meant to shelter civilians and discourage attacks through foreign presence. A German businessman, John Rabe, helped lead it, alongside other Western and Chinese organizers. It was not a peacekeeping force. It had no army and no legal power. It was a gamble that paperwork, flags, and persistence might restrain violence. In the first days after the occupation, people poured into the zone in waves. Families arrived with nothing but what they could carry, packed into schools and public buildings, desperate for any place that sounded protected. The organizers scrambled to register refugees, find food, and keep basic order as numbers climbed far beyond what the space could hold. They sent protests and requests to Japanese commanders, insisting the zone was neutral, but outside its borders, control remained shattered. and danger kept closing in. In the days after the occupation, the killing moved from scattered violence to a method. Japanese units looked for men they treated as enemies, not civilians. Anyone with a soldier's haircut, calloused hands, or a hint of a uniform got pulled aside. Former troops who had thrown away their gear learned it was not enough. The line between prisoner and civilian collapsed. Once someone was labelled a soldier, survival turned into a short, brutal countdown. Groups of captives were gathered from streets, ruins and checkpoints, then marched under guard to temporary holding sites. There, quick searches and hurried questions sorted people into categories that decided life or death. Some were bound together with rope or wire. Others were forced to kneel in rows while names and numbers meant nothing. These were not arrests leading to trials. They were selections. The goal was speed, control, and the removal of anyone seen as capable of resisting. Executions followed a pattern, mass groups taken out of view, then eliminated in bulk. Gunfire did part of the work, but bayonets and blades finished what bullets did not. Bodies were left where they fell, or pushed into pits and waterways to erase the count. As the process repeated, it grew easier to repeat again. Killing became routine labour, and each round of roundups widened the net because fear itself became evidence, and suspicion became enough to die. In the weeks after the occupation, violence stopped looking like a single burst and started feeling like a routine. Rape spread block by block, day after day, not as a rare crime, but as a method of control. Women and girls faced attacks in streets, in homes, and even near places meant for shelter. Families learned that hiding in place carried its own risk. Every night brought new searches, new screams, and the same lesson. No one could predict where safety ended. Survivors and witnesses described patterns that repeated with cruel consistency. Groups of soldiers moved through neighborhoods, demanding food, money, and valuables, then returning again when they suspected more remained. Men who protested often disappeared or were beaten until they stopped moving. Some assaults happened in front of relatives as punishment for refusing orders or for simply being present. The safety zone offered some protection, but it also became a target for raids and intimidation that tested its limits. Looting fed arson, and arson fed more looting. Shops emptied, warehouses broke open, and homes were stripped down to what could be carried. Then fires followed, sometimes to erase evidence, sometimes from careless destruction, sometimes to force people out of hiding. Whole streets lost what little order remained. The result was a city where survival meant constant calculation. When to flee, when to stay silent, when to give up everything. Terror became ordinary, and that was the point. Even as the killing continued, people inside Nanjing created a paper trail in real time. Members of the Safety Zone Committee kept diaries and daily logs because they needed proof to press complaints and to get help. They recorded dates, locations, and counts, not rumours. Letters went out to embassies and military authorities, listing rapes, abductions, and shootings as they happened. The violence did not pause for documentation. Documentation moved alongside it. That record did not come from one source. Missionaries, teachers, doctors, and Chinese residents wrote private journals, then compared notes when they could. Photographs and film appeared too, sometimes taken quickly, sometimes developed later, showing bodies, destroyed neighborhoods, and refugees packed into the zone. Burial groups kept ledgers because they had to account for the dead they collected and interred. Each entry fixed a moment in place and time, turning horror into a countable event. As weeks slid into early 1938, the reports kept stacking up. Safety zone files tracked repeated patterns. Soldiers searching shelters, dragging men away, assaulting women, and stripping houses bare. Complaints were written, delivered and ignored, then written again with more names and numbers. The key point was simple. These were not memories gathered years later. They were notes made under pressure, while people still hid, still fled, and still died. After Japan's surrender in 1945, the killings in Nanjing no longer sat only in diaries and reports. They entered courtrooms. In Tokyo, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East tried Japan's top wartime leaders. Nanjing became part of a larger case about aggressive war and atrocities, forced into legal categories: murder, rape, unlawful executions. Evidence now had to meet rules, not just shock consciences. Prosecutors relied on survivor statements, foreign eyewitness accounts, captured documents, and burial records to show a pattern, not isolated crimes. The tribunal focused on command responsibility, whether leaders knew, allowed, or failed to stop what their forces did. Some men were convicted and executed, others were sentenced to prison. Yet the courtroom lens narrowed the story. It rewarded what could be proven cleanly, and it left many direct perpetrators unnamed. In China, separate war crimes trials pursued individual officers and soldiers connected to Nanjing. These courts aimed lower down the chain, tying specific defendants to specific acts. Some were convicted and punished. Still, accountability remained uneven. Many suspects never appeared, protected by chaos, missing records, or flight. Others benefited from shifting post-war priorities as Japan rebuilt and new geopolitical threats emerged. Justice came, but it arrived incomplete, and that gap mattered. After the trials ended, many people expected the story to settle into history. Instead, the world split into new camps. The Cold War turned yesterday's enemies into today's partners, and priorities shifted fast. In Japan, rebuilding and stability mattered more than revisiting crimes. In China, the new government decided which wartime memories served politics and which ones stayed quiet. As alliances hardened, public memory narrowed. In Japan, some accounts stayed in libraries and court files, but they rarely led the national conversation. Many families avoided the subject, and schools often treated it briefly or carefully. In China, Nanjing remained a wound, yet talk about it rose and fell with diplomatic needs. Silence did not mean forgetting, it meant control. In that space, selective remembrance grew into something sharper. A few writers and politicians started to suggest the killings had been exaggerated or that chaos of war explained everything. Small claims spread because they sounded safer than the full truth. Internationally, attention moved to nuclear fears and new conflicts, and Nanjing faded from headlines. The denial did not begin loudly. It began by being convenient. By the late 20th century, the long quiet around Nanjing did not hold. Researchers returned to wartime diaries, burial records, and trial transcripts and treated them as living evidence, not relics. Survivors, many now elderly, gave interviews and testimony that fixed names, places, and routines of violence into public memory. Museums and memorial halls expanded, turning private grief into an official story. The subject moved from specialist circles into everyday awareness. Mass media amplified that shift. Television programs, newspaper series, and widely read books made the events harder to ignore, and international audiences also heard the claims in plain language. Each new release pushed the discussion outward, but it also raised the stakes. Numbers, responsibility, and intent became battlegrounds, not footnotes. As attention grew, so did pressure on governments, schools, and publishers to take a clear position. Public memory started to look like a verdict. That spotlight triggered a modern backlash. Organized denial campaigns questioned the scale of killing, recast atrocities as isolated crimes, or shifted blame onto chaos and war in general. Some attacked the credibility of witnesses. Others targeted museums and textbooks, insisting the story served politics rather than truth. The dispute no longer centered on what happened in 1937 alone. It centered on what could be said about it and by whom. Denial became a strategy, not just a doubt. By the early 21st century, Nanjing no longer depended on rumor and fragments. Archives had expanded. Private diaries surfaced. Military files, court records and burial reports circulated in print and online. Researchers compared lists of the dead, traced units, checked dates, and tested photographs against maps. The same events that once happened in chaos now sat inside folders and databases. But more paper never meant more peace. It meant more arguments. The fight shifted into schools and government language. Textbook lines turned into political signals. How many victims, what words described the killings, and whether responsibility sounded direct or vague. Official statements became closely watched, especially when leaders visited shrines, museums, or memorials. Each commemoration carried consequences abroad, and each omission triggered anger at home. Nanjing stayed present not only as history, but as a measure of national pride and national guilt. That contrast drove the tension. In 1937, terror unfolded faster than anyone could record it, and many victims disappeared without names. In the present, the struggle revolved around what documentation could prove and what opponents tried to cast into doubt. Denial did not always reject the violence outright. It narrowed it, reframed it, or demanded impossible certainty. The massacre remained contested ground because the record itself had become a battlefield.